Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about gardening, botanical history, and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is May 17th, and there are just 34 days until the first day of summer. Today we celebrate a woman who became a renowned floral artist late in life, and we'll also learn about an English poet and politician who loved nature. We'll recognize some of the final sentiments about the wonder of nature from a television dramatist, screenwriter, and journalist, and we'll hear an adorable excerpt about growing a mitten tree. We'll grow that garden library today with a book about a botanist who loved the gardens, landscapes, and ecology of the southern coastal plain. And then we'll wrap things up with the story of the scientist who helped with the first color photograph. But first, here's today's curated news. Today's curated garden news comes to us from House and Garden. This is an article that was written by Fiona Mackenzie Johnston, and it's called How Constance Spry Radicalized the Art of Floristry. Well, I am a huge Constance Spry fan, and so I was so excited to learn about the new exhibition about Constance Spry, or Connie as she was known, and also to learn a little bit more from Fiona about how Connie transformed the way that we decorate with flowers. And that's something I love doing. Now, let me share with you a quick little excerpt from Fiona's post, just to give you a little taste for how innovative Connie was when it came to her designs. Fiona writes, "In the late autumn of 1928, police were called to Atkinson's Perfumery on Bond Street to monitor the throngs of people that were hoping to catch a glimpse of an airy arrangement of clematis seed heads, blackberry-laden brambles, reddish-brown leaves, and orchids that was all together in one of Constance Spry's designs." And can you imagine that? Throngs of people waiting to see a floral design. That sounds absolutely otherworldly to me. Now, Fiona points out in this article that Connie was inspired by 16th and 17th century Dutch flower paintings. And that reminded me of a recent post in the listener community over on Facebook. So in the listener community, there is a woman named Adrienne Williams, and she just shared a beautiful floral arrangement from her garden. And this was done, I think, over the weekend. I want to say on Saturday or Sunday. Anyway, as I was strolling through all of the pictures in the Facebook group, I stumbled on this absolutely stunning arrangement. And so when I wrote Adrienne back, I said, "You must be a designer." And she said, "I'm not actively working right now, but I have in the past." Well, Adrienne, I think Constance Spry would have loved your arrangement. And then listener Anna Weaver jumped in and she said, "Adrienne's work reminds me of this painting from a few days ago." And it turns out that Anna follows a Twitter account. It's called A Painting a Day on Twitter. And I love little posts like that on Twitter. And so when I stumble on accounts that do those kinds of creative things, I love to follow them. So I want to thank Anna for reaching out and sharing that fantastic tip with us in the Facebook group. And also Adrienne, just, fantastic that you shared this gorgeous arrangement with us. Totally inspiring and totally up Constance Spry's alley. She's smiling down on you from heaven, I'm quite sure. In any case, if you want to read this article about Constance Spry, her fantastic life, there are wonderful little tidbits in here from Fiona, right down to the pottery that she loved to use. There's this gorgeous display case that's showing all of it, and I'm just drooling over it. You guys can check it out for yourself in the Facebook group for the show. Just head on over there. If you can't find it, go up to the top, right underneath the header, you'll see a little magnifying glass, and you can type in the word Constance, and this post will pop right up. Now, if you're not in the Facebook group for the show, I do hope that eventually you get around to joining our little group. And to do that, all you need to do is head on up to the search bar in Facebook where you'd look for an old friend and type in the words Daily Gardener Community and then request to join. I'd love to meet you in the group. Now, before we get to today's botanical history, I just want to share a couple of things that I thought were really cool that happened over this weekend. First of all, I was contacted by a listener of the show, Katerina and Jason Scaife, and they happened to be traveling through Minneapolis and St. Paul on their way to buy a trailer. And Katerina reached out and she said, "Do you have any suggestions for us for nurseries that we can visit as we're heading through the Twin Cities?" And so I said, absolutely. I recommended Tonkadale and Bachman's, and then also Kelly and Kelly, which is a very special little nursery that I don't get to very often, but it's truly a one-of-a-kind experience. Well, they had the opportunity to go to Tonkadale, which they liked. They said it was very busy, classic nursery experience, but then they went and visited Kelly and Kelly, and their hearts were absolutely captivated by this truly special nursery. And so it sounds like they'll be popping back into town here over the next month or so, and I think they're going to visit it again. But I'm absolutely thrilled that they reached out, and hopefully this next time they'll pop in and they can see my garden and we'll get a chance to know each other a little bit better. But it was just a thrill to hear from them and then connect with them and hear that they actually did get a chance to stop by these nurseries that I'd recommended. And, you know, when I was talking to Jason earlier, because then we ended up talking by phone, he said it was the coolest thing. They were driving through Maple Grove. They saw the sign on the highway right as I was saying on the podcast that it's created in lovely Maple Grove, Minnesota. So that was kind of a strange little kismet that happened there, but I thought it was really kind of cool too. So fantastic to hear from them. And then I also just wanted to give a quick shout out to Danny Perkins, who after 16 months was able to head down to Atlanta this past week, spend some time with his sister. And of course, what did they do? They spent time in the garden together. And for so many of us who have been waiting to see our family members, I know what a special treat this was for Danny. And so many of us can relate to this. In fact, he shared a picture of a cake and it had the number 388 on it because they were combining all of the birthdays and celebrations that they had missed over the past 16 months. And so it was just wonderful to see that. So congratulations. And I loved the pictures from the Atlanta garden that they had a chance to work on there together. I think that's fantastic. In any case, hopefully you are getting out and spending some time in your garden as the weather starts to warm up. Here in Minnesota, where I'm at in the Twin Cities, I've been holding back because the weather's been a little cold. And I know that up here, for me at least, I need to wait until around Memorial Day weekend because that's when it will be reliably warm here, especially in the evenings. And so the combination of those night temperatures and soil temperatures is what I'm paying attention to. And I would much rather have the nurseries and the garden centers take care of all this plant material until the weather is finally warm enough, and then I'm able to do it without dragging things into the garage or having to run out with a sheet. Because the last thing I need is more work anywhere, inside or outside the house. So there you go. But I do want to just mention, because I know some of you have asked me about this, yes, I am working with my student gardeners. I put out an appeal in my community here in Maple Grove and also up at the cabin up in Wyoming. And I'm starting to put together my team of student gardeners for 2021. And I am so excited to get back in the garden again. And then also to have my helpers with me, because especially with my arthritis, I have to be so careful not to overdo it. So these kids are my arms and my legs in the garden. And they're also such a wonderful teacher to me. I learn so much from them seeing the garden through their eyes. So I will be sharing some of our experiences together this summer so that you too can learn from these kids, these wonderful student gardeners that I work with. All right, it's time for today's Botanical History. Here's Botanical History for today, May 17th. Today is the birthday of the botanical tissue paper decoupage artist Mary Delaney, who was born on this day, May 17th in 1700. Mary led an extraordinary life. When she was 17, her family forced her to marry a 60-year-old man. Mary soon discovered he was an alcoholic. To make matters worse, when he died, Mary's husband forgot to include her in his will. Well, despite her lack of inheritance, Mary quickly realized that as a widow, she had much more freedom than she had had as a single woman. And fate brought more luck to Mary when she met and fell in love with an Irish doctor and pastor named Patrick Delaney. They married in June of 1743. And although her family wasn't thrilled with the idea of a second marriage, Mary did it anyway. And she and Patrick moved away to his home in Dublin. Patrick's garden was a thing of beauty, and Mary wrote to her sister, "The fields are planted in a wild way, forest trees and bushes that look so natural you would not imagine it, a work of art. There is a very good kitchen garden and 2 fruit gardens, which will afford us a sufficient quantity of everything we can want. And there are several prettinesses I can't explain to you, little wild walks, private seats, and lovely prospects. One seat I'm particularly fond of is in a nut grove, and there's a seat in a rock that is placed at the end of a cunning wild path. The brook entertains you with a purling rill." Well, after 25 years of wedded bliss, Patrick died. Mary was widowed again, this time at the age of 68. But Mary's life was not over. In another stroke of luck, Mary hit it off with the wealthy Margaret Bentinck, the Duchess of Portland. And together, they pursued botanical activities. The 2 women loved to go out into the fields and collect specimens. And it was through the Duchess that Mary got to know Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander. When Mary was in her early 70s, she took up decoupage, which was all the rage at the time, and she created these marvelous depictions of flowers. Today, historians believe that Mary probably dissected plants to create her art. Botanists from all over Europe would send her specimens, and King George III and Queen Charlotte were her patrons. They ordered any curious or beautiful plant to be sent to Mary when in blossom so that she could use them to create her art. Her paper mosaics, as she called them, were made out of tissue paper, and Mary created almost 1,000 pieces of art between the ages of 71 and 88. And if you've ever seen any of her most spectacular decoupage pieces, you'll be blown away at the thought of them being made from tiny pieces of tissue paper by Mary Delaney in the twilight of her life in the late 1700s. And it was on this day, May 17th, in 1824, that the diaries of the English Romantic poet, satirist, and politician Lord Byron were burned by 6 of his friends. The act was intended to protect his privacy, but it's also been described as the greatest crime in literary history. The loss likely impacted botanical literature as well, since Lord Byron also wrote about gardens and nature. Once he famously wrote, "There is a pleasure in the pathless woods. There is a rapture on the lonely shore. There is society where none intrudes by the deep sea and music in its roar. I love not man less, but nature more." And today is the birthday of the English television dramatist, screenwriter, and journalist Dennis Potter, who was born on this day, May 17th, in 1935. Best known for his 2 hit movies, Pennies from Heaven in 1978 and The Singing Detective in 1986, Dennis sat down for an interview with Melvin Bragg, and it was titled "Seeing the Blossom." At the time, Dennis was at the end of his life. He was dying from pancreatic cancer, and in a brave and incredibly candid move, he spoke about what his life was like, knowing that the end of his life was near, and how it gave him a heightened appreciation for what was going on around him. He said, "Now at this season, the blossom is out in full now. There in the west early is a plum tree. It looks like an apple blossom, but it's white. And looking at it, instead of saying, 'Oh, that's a nice blossom,' now last week, looking at it through the window when I'm writing, I see it is the whitest, frothiest, blossomest blossom that there ever could be, and I can see it. Things are both more trivial than they ever were, and more important than they ever were. And the difference between the trivial and the important doesn't seem to matter, but the nowness of everything is absolutely wondrous." It's time for today's Unearthed Words. Today's Unearthed Words come to us from the American author and illustrator of over 90 children's books, Stephen Castle Kellogg. This is an excerpt from his book, The Missing Mitten Mystery. Finding missing mittens is hard work. It would be easier to grow new ones. Let's try planting the other mitten right here in the garden. Next spring, when the snow melts, a little mitten tree might sprout. Miss Seltzer and I would take good care of it all summer long. In the fall, we'd pick ripe mittens. Then I'd give mittens on Christmas, and mittens on birthdays, and mittens on Valentine's Day. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, On Harper's Trail by Elizabeth Findlay Shores. This book came out in 2008, and the subtitle is Roland McMillan Harper, Pioneering Botanist of the Southern Coastal Plain. In this book, Elizabeth shares the first full-length biography of the accomplished botanist, documentary photographer, and Southern Coastal Plain explorer Roland McMillan Harper, who was born in 1878. The celebrated plant scientist of the New York Botanical Garden, Bassett McGuire, said that Roland had, quote, the greatest store of field experience of any living botanist of the Southeast. And yet, the years obscured Roland's scientific contributions, including his unique insights on wetlands and fire. Along with his brother Francis, Roland traced William Bartram's route through Alabama and the Florida Panhandle. And in his work describing plant species and writing papers, Roland corresponded with the leading botanists of his time, including Nathaniel Britton, Hugo de Vries, and Charles Davenport, just to name a few. This book is 296 pages of the life story of a maverick botanist from the North who fell in love with the gardens, landscapes, and ecology of the Southern Coastal Plain. You can get a copy of On Harper's Trail by Elizabeth Findlay Shores and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $25. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. It was on this day, May 17th, in 1861, that the first color photograph was taken. The picture was of a tartan ribbon displayed by Scottish scientist James Clerk Maxwell to the Royal Institution in London. But this is not James Clerk Maxwell's claim to fame. He's actually remembered for his formulation of the classical theory of electromagnetic radiation. And here's a fun story about James Clerk Maxwell. In 1922, when Albert Einstein visited the University of Cambridge, his host announced that he had done great things because he stood on Isaac Newton's shoulders. Einstein corrected him and replied, "No, I don't. I stand on the shoulders of Maxwell." In 1879, James Clerk Maxwell wrote a letter to his friend William Thompson. It's a letter that gardeners can delight in, and it was titled Peacocks as Gardeners. He wrote this: "We got our original stock from Mrs. McCunn in Ard Hollow. At that time, in 1860, the garden there was the finest on the coast, and the peacocks sat on the parapets and banks near the house. Mr. McCunn was very fond of his garden and very particular about it, but he also cared for his peacocks, and whenever he went out, he had bits of bread and such for them. Mrs. Maxwell, my wife, always gets the peacocks to choose the gardener, and they have chosen one who has now been 7 years with us. At seed time in the garden, they're confined in a little house where they have some Indian corn and water. When the hen is sitting, she is not confined, for she keeps to her nest, and nobody is supposed to know where that is, but she comes once a day to the house and calls for her dinner and eats it and goes back to her nest at once. The peacocks will eat the young cabbages, but the gardener tells them to go. They find it pleasanter to be about the house and to sit on either side of the front door. You can just about imagine the gardeners coming to work for the Maxwells and having to go through scrutiny from the peacocks. Well, James was both a professor and a researcher, and he once likened his work in academia to the life of bees. He wrote, "In a university, we are especially bound to recognize not only the unity of science itself, but the communion of the workers in science. We are too apt to suppose that we are congregated here merely to be within reach of certain appliances of study, such as museums and laboratories, libraries and lecturers, so that each of us may study what he prefers. I suppose that when the bees crowd around the flowers, it is for the sake of the honey that they do so, never thinking that it is the dust which they are carrying from flower to flower, which is to render possible a more splendid array of flowers and a busier crowd of bees in the years to come. We cannot, therefore, do better than to improve the shining hour in helping forward the cross-fertilization of the sciences." Isn't that a grand way to look at the legacy of your work? This past week, I've been putting together my roster of student gardeners for 2021. And as we work together during the summer, I like to end every session with 10 minutes of photography. The kids walk around the garden and take incredible color images with their phones. And I am sure that somewhere James Clerk Maxwell is absolutely delighted with how easy it is to take color photographs and how easy it is to share them. When we're all done, we gather together in the front of the house and they simply airdrop all of those pictures onto my phone. And when they're gone, I have about 300, give or take 20 or so, pictures of my garden that I get to look through and share on social media and send to my own friends and family. But I also think about those photos in terms of legacy, because I want you to think for a second about what a typical teenager's camera roll looks like on their phone. Let me tell you, it's loaded with memes, selfies, homework, pets, friends, maybe a sibling or two. But after a summer of working in my garden, these kids are going to have hundreds of images of flowers, landscapes, leaves, stones, water, raindrops, insects, and Sunny, my dog. How do we get kids interested in horticulture? I think about that question a lot. And I think we have to change what kids see every day. And we have to get flowers on their phones. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Maple Grove and Wyoming, Minnesota. If you want to read today's show notes, just head on over to thedailygardener.org. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. And don't forget that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook and request to join. Last but not least, you can always get in touch by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.